Hello, I am FerrousPilot, and today I'm interviewing Folmer Kelly, who makes up half of the indie gaming studio known as Sets and Settings. They've made a few games in the past and are currently working on their most ambitious project yet, a hectic arcade game by the name of Trestle. Folmer, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
All right, man. Before we do anything else, I just want to let people know what Trestle's all about. So, could you give us a brief overview of the gameplay?
Yeah, so Trestle is my elevator pitch is essentially it is Super Crate Box in a Mega Man Battle Network setting. So you have a grid, you move around on the grid, and you collect weaponry. And for every weapon you collect, you add to your score. And then on the other side of the grid, enemies keep spawning, and you have to survive using the weapons that you collect.
All right, so outside of what Mega Man Battle Network and Super Crate Box offer, what kinds of new things are you adding to Trestle?
Oh wow, you're going for the hard-hitting stuff here. Okay, it is essentially just a very focused arcade experience. It's very distilled down to the essence of skill-based, Twitch-based gaming. There is strategy involved. You can focus on that if you really want to, but essentially the game forces you to continuously get better at doing what you need to do. So it's very much what we do at Sets and Settings. We take very specific mechanics and we explore them as deep as they can go. Yeah, I think that pretty much sums up what we're trying to do with this game.
All right. And could you tell us a little bit about some of the unique weapons or enemies that we might find in Trestle?
Yeah, so I'm trying to not be too much inspired by Super Crate Box, aside from it being a very convenient comparison to make. So what I'm trying to do is I have all these weapons that kind of make you think about how you're using them. So for every different weapon that you come across, there's a different way to use them correctly. So for instance, you have something that's very powerful, like a flamethrower. It basically fills up the entire screen with fire and it destroys almost anything in one hit. But then the drawback is that once it starts firing, it's going to fire for a while and you cannot move while it's doing so. So you really need to, when you have that weapon, you really need to pick and choose when you're going to be using it. And then you have something like a regular, you have basically your blaster shot that goes quite fast. It doesn't do that much damage, but it also doesn't stick you to the ground, so you're not stuck for a long period of time. So you can just move around and shoot way faster. And then we tried to switch it up a little bit with some of the weapons just to make it a little, to really make you think about what you're trying to do. So there's energy discs that will actually come back to you, kind of like a boomerang or like the crate box. What is it, the disc gun? I think they have that moves in the same way. I also have a couple of things that I'm working on now that I actually haven't shown off yet that are kind of like familiars, like you would see in The Binding of Isaac or in Risk of Rain. So they kind of just they're little turrets and they pop up next to you and they fight along with you for a little while until they die. And one thing I'm experimenting with right now is a weapon that doesn't actually shoot, but it creates a shield and it absorbs everything that an enemy shoots at you, and then it shoots it back.
Oh,
That's an exclusive that you're getting now.
oh yeah. Seems like a pretty cool weapon. Reminds me of what's it called? Titanfall.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It really look. Yeah, my focus is really trying to come up with things that make you switch up what you're doing the whole time. So you can't just spam the button because you're just gonna lose.
Hmm. So would you say there's sort of puzzle strategy element to it as well?
A little bit, but you have to keep moving, so it never strays too far from the whole arcade feeling of it.
Mhm. And could you tell us a little bit about how you started with game development?
Yeah, so I was, okay, let me take it all the way back. I had an NES when I was a kid, and then I did not care about video games as soon as I became a teenager, like at all anymore. I completely lost track of video games and I skipped a whole bunch of consoles. And later in life, I became a graphic designer, and I always felt like it wasn't enough. Like, it just didn't fulfill what I wanted to be doing creatively. So I was really just looking around what I wanted to do with my life. And then that was at the time that indie gaming became a little bit more mainstream. I think Braid had just come out a little while ago, and things like Super Meat Boy for Xbox Live Arcade and VVV by Terry Kavanagh were getting some buzz at least. I don't think they were out yet, but they were getting some buzz. And I started discovering these things, and I thought it was so interesting because I hadn't paid attention to video games in such a long time. I was like, wow, everything changed. Like, this is completely different from what I know about video games. So I started looking into it, just digging through websites, and I found TickSource. And I found out that there were all these tools now, and there was such a community and everything. So I started with Flixel and Flashpunk, and I tried all these different things, and it turned out I could actually make games myself. And that's kind of how I got started with making video games. I really had to yeah, seeing some games hooked me in, and I just started digging into it, and I discovered I could do this. Anyone can do this. And then it went really fast.
Right. So you got into indie game development a little bit later than most indie devs do in terms of age. And do you think this provided some amount of difficulties for you? Could you go into that?
I wouldn't say it provided so much difficulty, but there is something to it though, because like I said, I really had to dig into I had to dig into the whole indie game scene, and then you start reading about other developers, and you start reading interviews and stuff. Like, you get into it, and you just want to know everything about what's going on, and then almost every interview that you read or everything you hear, it's always these people, and they're in their early 20s or now in their mid 20s, and the interview answer is always like, yeah, I started coding when I was 6 years old, and I discovered how to hack my mom's old ass computer. And like, for me, it was always like, ah, shit, I never had anything like that. Like, the first, almost 30 years of my life, like, I knew nothing about making games or programming or coding. Like, it was all just, and that was completely alien to me. So coming into it at an older age, it is a little intimidating to compare yourself to people with that kind of experience.
And you did have a background in terms of graphic design. Do you think that helped you out with the pixel art that you use in all of your games?
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. I didn't know anything about pixel art until I started looking into making games myself, but I probably picked it up faster than a complete non-artist would have done.
Hmm.
And now I'm completely in love with making pixel art.
All right. So if say there's some up and coming indie game developer watching this who wants to make their own pixel art for their games, what kinds of tips would you give them?
Oh, I always say the same thing because this is how I learned it. I didn't follow any tutorials or anything. What I did was I went to like any of the known pixel art forums, like Way of the Pixel or what's the other one, Pixel Joint, And I also went to this one thread on TikSource, which is called "Show Us Some of Your Pixel Art." And what I did was I would just scroll through all these amazing images, and I would pick something that I liked that wasn't too big, and I would just simply download it, open it up in Photoshop, and copy it pixel for pixel. So just right next to it in the same file, I would just just copy the whole thing. And
And
what
that
you
helped you learn.
And well, what you get at some point is you start to understand why things work the way they work. So you have this like really small piece, like a little sprite, and say that it has, it has like a black outline, but then on top it has a brown outline because it has blonde hair.
Hmm.
And you start copying it and you see like, okay, so if I shade my outline, then it becomes part of the hairline instead of the outline of the body, and that makes a difference. So you pick up all these little nuances, and then you can start putting that into pieces of your own.
All right, that's pretty cool. And you've mentioned earlier that Trestle is pretty much the largest project you've worked on so far, the most ambitious one. And how is it like transitioning from somewhat simpler games into something a little bit more involved?
It is really difficult just having the discipline to work on something for so long. But it's also, I don't know actually. It was, in a way, it was a natural thing because I wasn't. I mean, when I came up with the idea for Trestle, I was like, oh, this is interesting. Let me just make this. And I wasn't looking at it like, oh, wow, this is something that I need to be spending more time on than my usual work. It just progressed naturally that way. I just kept adding to it and adding to it. And here we are, something like 6 months later, 5 months later. Yes, 6, 7 months later. But it just happened, really. And it's definitely it's different. I really noticed that. I mean, it has pros and cons. It's nice to be able to spend an entire day on drawing one thing instead of saying like I need to have this out there by next week, so let's just go with it. But it's exhausting sometimes. You're looking at the same thing the whole time. You're testing the same things the whole time. It requires way more discipline, and you get more attached to something that you spend so much time on. Because I release a lot of small games. Almost every month I'll try and release something, and it's so easy for me to then say like, okay, well, the collision detection is off in this part, but it doesn't matter because I made it in 2 days or whatever. And I don't have that with this one. I don't have that. I can't take that distance anymore because every little piece I've spent, weeks and months on.
Right. So it's really a matter of polishing and refining. And what what have you learned about that portion of game development on by working on Trestle?
Not so much to be honest. Coming from a graphic design background, polish and the visuals in general have always been very important to the games that I make. So I tend to actually polish while I'm working on prototypes. I don't do the thing where you have like you test a mechanic by taking little boxes and seeing if it works. Like I need to have the finished sprite immediately, otherwise it doesn't work for me. I need to have like a nice tile set, and I never go back afterwards and change things up. Like everything when I put it in the game, like it has to be done, it has to be final, it has to have like all of the particles and explosions and the animations and everything. So in terms of that, it didn't really make so much of a difference for me, that aspect of it.
All right. And how about polishing and refining the gameplay itself, not just the animations?
That is a different story indeed. Actually, we took the game to GDC. We were graciously invited by the lovely people at the Indie Mega booth to display Trestle at the first Indie Mega booth that was at GDC. So we got a lot of feedback from there. And then a month later, I was actually at this other game expo game festival. It was more like an art gallery, really, in Berlin called Amaze,
Mhm.
which is really cool. So I also got a lot of feedback there. And honestly, the response was, yeah, it's nice. And for something that I spent so much time on, that just wasn't good enough. So the past, ever since, I compiled a whole list of feedback, and from that point, I basically tore everything down and I started rebuilding it. And I also changed the art, but that was mostly because I wanted to have the game in widescreen, and it just was in this tiny web resolution before. But yeah, it makes a huge difference when you're working on bigger projects. Like you really want to start listening to your playtesters, and they play almost as big a part in the game design as you do at that point.
And do you find that because it's your game, it's something you've poured so much time into, that maybe when you're playtesting it yourself, you have a sort of biased opinion that you get a good third party opinion, you can actually make better changes to the game as a result?
Yeah. If we had this interview before GDC and the maze happened, I would have disagreed strongly. I would have yelled at you because I know best. But after I received all that feedback, and the thing about like when you have multiple playtesters, because when you have like you make a game and someone reviews your game, like especially on the internet, you get like a lot of game reviews and whatever, and people say whatever the hell they want, like kids playing flash games, they have no filters.
Yeah.
So, and it's easy to just say like, yeah, that's your opinion, whatever. But when you start doing GDC and you have like 100 people in one day coming through playing the game, and they're kind enough to talk to you about their experience with the game, and then from those 100 people you hear 80 people saying the exact same thing, they have the exact same complaint. You cannot ignore that anymore. You can't say that's your opinion, because then it's the majority's opinion. And at that point you start realizing like, yeah, okay, I don't have all the answers, but my players, by and large, they do.
All right, man. I think we're gonna round it off for there, unless you have anything more to say.
um I'm good.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the interview, Folmer.
Not a problem, thank you.
And thank you to the viewers for watching this. There will be a link to the Trestle's Tumblr blog and other stuff in the video description. And that's going to be it. If you'd like to see me interview somebody else, please leave a comment below. And if you like the video, please be sure to like or subscribe. It helps me out a great deal. I'll see you next time.